I have long held prejudice against the Ora Good Cat, firstly because of its name, and secondly because of its marketing as primarily a car for women. But Ora has somewhat readjusted its communication and instead suggested that this is the consummate city car. And in addition to significant price drops that now put this under 150,000 ringgit for the range-topping 500 Ultra, we've spent the last week with this car figuring out whether or not Ora's claims are true, or if you're better off spending your money with BYD. My name is Aiman Abdullah, this is Malaysian Motoring, this is our review of the 2024 Ora Good Cat 500 Ultra. Now again, the model that we have here is called the 500 Ultra. The 500 in reference to its CLTC claimed range of 500 kilometers, which is nonsense. Now before we get into the salient stuff, I want to first talk about the powertrain. So underneath the skin, you will find a single electric motor powering the front wheels, producing 143 horsepower and 210 Newton meters of torque. Underneath the floor, you'll find a 63.1 kilowatt hour battery, which can be recharged at AC speeds of up to 6.6 kilowatts or DC speeds at up to 60. Now at 60 kilowatts, they say that this car will go from 10 to 80% in a little over half an hour. It is worth pointing out that the vehicles from BYD, be it the Dolphin or indeed the Atto 3, can charge it up to 88 kilowatts for their flagship models, which does significantly reduce the charge time. Now, despite that, I would like to point out the fact that this car is surprisingly efficient, although we'll get onto that a little bit later. But since we've covered all of the boring stuff, I think what you want me to talk about most of all is the styling. Now, the Ora Good Cat is very clearly something that is designed to be cutesy, to be soft and cute. And I have to say that initially walking up to this car, I wasn't really that big of a fan, but again, after having spent a little bit of time with it, it really isn't all that bad because the devil is in the details. So for example, while this front end does look very similar to what you've seen before from, say, an original Volkswagen Beetle or indeed a Mini, especially with these headlights, I do think that little details like the little bit of chrome on the bottom as well as these little sort of geometric dimples on either side does set this car apart a little bit. And certainly compared to vehicles like the BYD Atto 3 or the Chery Omoda E5, the Ora Good Cat does look significantly bolder than those vehicles. Now, up here, you will find a bonnet, underneath which you will find all of the electric gubbins. There is no frunk here. But talking about these headlights, again, in addition to them being rather cutesy, they are also full LED, which means the main beam, high beam, and indicators all live up here. There are no secondary stuff going on down there. And also, because it's an electric car, naturally, there is no grille. All the cooling is controlled via that little slip down there. And I think that it does make this front end look a little bit clean. One thing that I would like to point out, however, are these power domes, which I think Ora must have picked up from AMG, but with 143 horsepower, I don't think it deserves them. But I think it's the side profile of the Ora Good Cat which I find the most appealing, because there is something about it that admittedly makes me smile a little every time I walk up to it. It's very similar to how I felt about the Volkswagen Beetle initially, although that car was bottle green, this is pistachio green. Now, rolling stock is handled by a set of 17-inch alloy wheels wrapped in GT Comfort 225 tyres. Now, these are designed for slightly lower rolling resistance, and so it does help eke out a little bit more range. Although, to me, I think that the performance on these tyres could have been improved slightly, perhaps in terms of road noise, because that seems to be a slightly more prevalent issue. Now, moving further down the side, it actually brings up another thing about this car that I'm not a big fan of, and that has to do with the door handles. Now, this car does come with a keyless entry and go system. However, the lock and unlock functionality only exists on the driver's side, which means that if you're from here and you want to lock the car, good luck with that. Now, moving further down the side, naturally, this car is a 5-door hatchback, which means that egress and ingress into the second row is a lot easier than a Beetle. But overall, I think that the side profile does look quite clean. There's not a lot in terms of design features and aesthetics because you're meant to look at this car as a whole rather than at its details. It is worth pointing out, however, that the Ora Good Cat can be had in a multitude of colors, some of which have a two-tone effect with a cut-off point here and also on the A-pillar. And I will admit that this car does look quite fetching in, say, a red or even the verdant green, which comes with a white top. I know, bit weird, but so is this car. It's actually the back end of the Ora Good Cat that I find a little bit questionable, and it starts firstly with the badging, because you have Ora displayed prominently on the boot lid, followed by Good Cat on that side and GWM here, and so I think that this back end is a little bit busy. I say that because clearly efforts have been made to try and clean up this rear, although this one's quite dirty, by moving the brake light to the glass housing up here, which I think is a very odd choice given the fact that this tailgate would have been nice to have a nice sort of wraparound kind of effect, similar to what you get from the Microlino out of Sweden. Now, because the light lives up here, you do have a light bar, but this functions solely as the positioning lights and the brake lights because the indicators and reverse lights live down here. Now, those of you who watched this channel before will know that I generally object to having indicators on the bumper because they are mounted too low. When you're talking about, say, motorbike riders and so on, their eyes will naturally be drawn to the higher light cluster up here, and so they may not notice an indicator down here. This is especially noteworthy when you're trying to, say, change lanes in traffic jams on a motorway. Now, beyond that, obviously there is no exhaust pipe back here because this car is fully electric, and you do get a centrally mounted fog light, which I think is good to have, I guess, although not really functional in our market unless you own a Vios. Now, the other thing that I have issue with is actually this boot, because in addition to this tailgate not being powered, the space in here is really not that great. It's not particularly deep and it's not particularly tall either, and because of the shape of this car, it does mean that your cutoff point is about here, so you can't be loading two very large luggage bags back here, or at least anything that will jut out beyond this point. On top of that, the load lip in this car is absolutely shocking, which means that taking things in and out will require effort to lift it over that lip, and you will most likely be scuffing this little bit of plastic back here. And because it's light colored, it does mean that it might come out a little bit more prominently. Now, underneath the boot floor, you will find a little bit of space, just enough for the charging cables and stuff like that, but mostly you're not really going to be using it because it's mostly stuffed with styrofoam. And of course, if you want to increase the capacity back here, you can fold the rear seat 60-40, but again, you're not revealing that much space. And there's also a little bit of a lip, which is not great. Now, inside the Good Cat, this is a broadly pleasant experience because for starters, the interior design does seem quite sensible and logically laid out, at least on the surface. I will admit that the design features in here are sort of a mishmash of things that we've seen from other brands. These dual digital displays, for example, are lifted from Mercedes-Benz. These toggle switches down here, that's out of a Mini. I could say the same thing about this houndstooth type fabric up here, as well as this sort of fluted seats, which again also remind me significantly of what we used to see from Mini. But I will say that in this pistachio green color, you also get that extension into the interior, like on these seats as well as on the dash, which is done up in this sort of nice, sort of felty type material with some contrast stitching done up in orange in order to match the orange details that are not only on these aircon vents, but also here on the steering wheel, which I think is quite a nice little touch. Now, beyond that, in terms of comfort, the interior is sort of a hit and miss, because while this driver's seat is electrically powered with a massage function, I will add, it doesn't come with lumbar support, but it does offer memory functionality. This passenger seat, however, is completely manual, which is a little bit of a shame given the fact that this is a 143,000 ringgit car. And in terms of the ergonomics, it's also not that great either, because while I can move the seat backwards and forwards, I can adjust the height, I can't quite adjust the angle, which means that my legs end up sort of dangling like this, or they lack the under-thigh support that I would like instead. The same goes for the steering wheel, which can be adjusted for the angle but not the reach, or at least if it can, I may not have been yanking it hard enough. Now, beyond that, at least everything else seems quite sensible, because you have physical buttons on the steering wheel which allow you to control not only your entertainment functions but also your level 2 ADAS functionality. You also get more physical buttons on either side in order to control, your basic functions, which I think are quite nice. And you do get a rotary gear selector down here, which is better than a stalk or, buttons perhaps. Now, in terms of practicality, this car is also a little bit of a hit and miss. So you get a couple of cup holders here and a bit of a shelf here. You get a wireless phone charger here, as well as some space that's rubberized in here should you want to put the key, for example. You also get a decently sized glove box, which is not that deep, but big enough, I think. And you also get a decently sized glove box here as well. However, It's when you start interacting with this car that you begin to realize that there are some things that could have been done better. So for example, this interface here does seem quite pleasant to use, and I will admit that it's quite responsive, but it doesn't come with wireless Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, only wired. And that brings me on to the USBs, which are only USB-A in this car, and so it requires the use of a cable. But weirdly, the power coming out of these USB ports are not nearly enough to even charge my phone while I'm using Android Auto, which means that I have come out of this car after a journey with my phone at a lower state of charge than it was when I got in, which is weird. And then when you do use Android Auto, which does take up the entirety of the screen, you then lose your air conditioning controls. But, I hear you say, there are toggle buttons down here. Surely that controls the air conditioning, right? Well, no, because this turns the air conditioning on and off, and this turns on and off the compressor itself. The ones on this side are for the demister, front and rear. To adjust the air conditioning, you have to go into the screen, and when you're in Android Auto, that means exiting Android Auto via 2 taps and then going into the air conditioning controls, which is not great when you are driving. However, as I've said on multiple videos before, I'm the type to leave the car at 23 degrees on auto, so I haven't had to do that often. But if you are the type to want to change the temperature frequently, then that is a bit of a problem. This is exacerbated by the fact this car doesn't come with any sort of voice control. There is a voice control buttons here on the steering wheel, but that will only trigger the voice control on your phone. So if you're using Apple, then that's Siri. If you're using Google, like me, then you get the Google Assistant, which means that it doesn't actually control any functionality within the car itself, which is annoying. Worse still, the screen up front also doesn't have any sort of functionality for the HVAC controls, although you will get sort of your basic views and so on and so forth to tell you things like energy consumption, etc. It is worth noting that the Good Cat that we get in Malaysia is not quite as highly specified as the Good Cat in other markets, where you can get a full digital cluster. Instead, here we just have a small screen that seems to be flanked on either side by sort of little readouts for the battery as well as your power consumption. I would have preferred the wider screen because then I would have been able to get a little bit more information, but as it stands, this is pretty much all right, and it's certainly better than the little display that you get on a BYD. Now, in terms of space, I will say that the Ora Good Cat is deceptively large. Because this is ultimately, they consider it a B segment hatchback, but I think this is more of a C segment crossover because there is plenty of space in here, not just for the front, because even at the rear, I have a good amount of knee room and a good amount of headroom despite the standard fit panoramic sunroof. For reference, I'm about 170 centimeters. And because of how I set up the front driver's seat, it does mean that I also have a good amount of space to tuck my feet in underneath the seats in front of me, which I need to because these seats are mounted quite low, and so you do need to stretch out in order to enjoy any sort of under-thigh support. Now, amenities back here are relatively limited because I do not get a set of air conditioning vents, not on the B-pillar or even in the center console. Instead, I just get a paltry single USB-A port. I do get some bottle holders in the doors and some cubby holes up here. I get some pockets behind the front seats, and there is a deployable armrest with a couple of cup holders. But aside from that, there really isn't that much in here. And so I would imagine that this car would be primarily focused at people with, say, young families, for example, because you can fit a couple of Isofix mounted seats back here without too much trouble. These doors don't open that wide, which means it might be a bit of a struggle to get a bulky rear-facing child seat in here, but in terms of the space between the backrest and the backrest of the front seats, you will have enough space for one of those child seats. You don't get the option to put a child seat in the front seat, however, because there are no Isofix mounts in front, so they're just stuck back here. But if they are back here, you will appreciate the fact that at least the window line in this car is not that high, so you will get a decent view out. And, you know, after a while, this cabin does cool enough for rear passengers to be pretty comfortable. In terms of quality, there is a slight drop in terms of the materials used, but at least everything that you do touch, like this fabric here, as well as the armrests, are nice and soft. The same goes for this center armrest, which is surprisingly squidgy, and it does have a nice gap here too, which means that, again, to me, this feels like a little bit more of a quality item than what you get from certain car makers, even like Toyota, where they just sort of flop. So this is good. Now, what's also good is actually the way this car drives. Because surprisingly, the Ora Good Cat does drive pretty well for what it is. Again, I'd like to point out that this is ultimately a B segment / C segment crossover, and so you need to temper your expectations. Let me just open the sun blind in the hopes of getting a little bit more light into this cabin. Now, the Ora Good Cat is ultimately aimed at being a city car, and I admit that driving this car around town, it is a pretty pleasant place to be. 143 horsepower and 210 Newton meters of torque doesn't seem like a lot, and I will admit that, of course, you can get electric vehicles within this space that are significantly more powerful. But I think that as an urban runabout, it doesn't need to be any more powerful. 210 Newton meters, for example, doesn't seem like a lot when there is a torque curve, but on an EV there isn't really one at all. So when you put your foot down, the car just goes, which is always nice. And while the overall power figures may suggest that this car ends up feeling a little bit wheezy, it can maintain 110, 120 kilometers an hour on the motorway without too much issue. And so I do think that this car was pretty well specified in terms of the powertrain. And being sat here, admittedly with the steering wheel set in its heaviest setting, I will admit that driving this has been pretty much a pleasant affair. If you were to lighten the steering wheel in any way, it does feel a little bit unnatural and therefore a little bit less confident on the road, but I do think that it is pretty okay. When you're driving about at town speeds or anything below 80 kilometers an hour, you will find that wind and road noise in this car is quite well suppressed. It is a surprisingly pleasant cabin. These seats are also decently comfortable, and of course the offering of a massage function does mean that, after a long day you can have a little bit of a, if that's your thing. But I've largely not used it because to me it doesn't feel all that effective. In fact, I would have traded the massage functionality for proper lumbar support or potentially ventilated seats, which is something that even the Dolphin Extended Range offers, let alone this. But it's when speeds begin to creep up a little that the Ora Good Cat's otherwise polished facade starts to tarnish a little bit. When you go above speeds of about 90 kilometers an hour, when you start approaching motorway cruising speeds, it's when you notice that the road noise in this car is quite pronounced. Those GT Comfort tires, as I mentioned earlier, do not really offer that much in terms of noise suppression, and it does seem to make itself quite known once the speeds start to creep up. At the very least, in both dry and wet conditions, the performance is pretty much okay. And because this car doesn't have that much torque, it does also mean that the tires do remain decently grippy through a variety of conditions. And so, driving this car on the motorway, for example, you will need to slow down for large corners and stuff like that, because naturally these tires are not really going to keep up. And again, the Ora Good Cat is not a car that's designed for that sort of thing. And so you don't really get that much feedback from the steering wheel or indeed from the seats in order to inform you that you might be at the limits of grip. But of course, if you're not trying to drive this car like an arse, which you shouldn't, then you will find that life in here is pretty much okay. The adaptive cruise control, rather the ADAS functionalities in this car are also pretty good. Now, compared to the Ora 07, which I've reviewed in the past, the ADAS functions on this car are far more polished. It is actually usable in town. It doesn't keep a ridiculous distance between itself and the vehicle in front, which is always nice. And it also means that you can rely on the system more often. So when you're stuck in traffic, for example, driving to and from work, you can just let the car do the majority of that work. It also helps that the car does show at least the vehicle in front of it in the driver's display, which means that, again, you always know what the car can see. This car also includes, as part of its ADAS functionalities, things like adaptive cruise control, autonomous emergency braking with pedestrian and cyclist detection, blind spot monitoring, lane keep and lane centering assist. It also has active intervention controls, like being able to avoid obstacles, as well as something called Wisdom Dodge, which is a ridiculous name. But what it does is when you're overtaking a lorry, for example, or a large vehicle, it actually provides a little bit more clearance by steering within the lane so that you're not so close to that large vehicle, which I think is quite smart, although wise might not necessarily be the word I'd use to describe it. So overall, I do think the Ora Good Cat is a pretty comprehensive package. It's just that there are a few things about this car that I think may require a little bit more attention. So firstly, there is the interface that I mentioned earlier, because I think that being able to adjust your air conditioning controls while you're on the move without having to jab blindly at the screen would be quite helpful. Perhaps the inclusion of a voice control system in this car in order for me to control those functions might also be of some use too. But of course, I think to me, what bugs me about this car primarily is the fact that, again, it's not quite as quiet as I would have liked. Now, I can blame that on the tires, although that said, I have also driven other cars that run GT tires like these that still offer better NVH, which means that overall refinement in this car could also be improved. But I think the biggest issue that I have with the Ora Good Cat has to be the charging. 6.6 kilowatt AC charging means that this car takes about 10.5 hours to charge from dead to full via an AC connection. Whereas for DC charging, 60 kilowatts does sit a little bit on the low side. And so if you're using a DC charger that is time-based, for example, you will realize that you won't be able to fully utilize the charging speed, and you will have to sit there for longer if you're trying to charge up the car. But I will say that compared to the Ora 07, which I again have driven previously, you can check out that video up here in the corner, I think that this is, again, a far more mature and polished package. It feels more like a car, which is strange because even Ora themselves describe this as a first generation EV, whereas the O7 is a second generation EV. And so I would have expected it to have gotten better, but rather it's gotten worse. This, for example, doesn't have all those ridiculous gimmicky things like the stupid noises when you lock and unlock the car or the stupid animations every time you get in. Again, this feels more like a car. This car does feel like a far more polished affair. So much so that if I were in the market for something about this big, this would be a car that I would consider. Such is the appeal of this overall package. Now, of course, there will be some of you that may, for example, wrinkle your nose at the fact that this car does have a relatively paltry boot. And I will admit that if you do have a young family and you're the type to bring about, say, strollers or push bikes, for example, then yes, that cargo room is not going to be adequate. And for them, I would ask them to consider vehicles like the BYD Atto 3 or potentially the Chery Omoda E5, both of which are proper B-segment SUVs and offer the sort of practicality that you would expect. And of course, the Omoda E5 and the BYD Atto 3 also offer some improvements in terms of the after-sales packages like warranty and service and so on and so forth. And so again, it is a little bit of a hit and miss. But for those of you who might be driven by the design of the Ora Good Cat, I really wouldn't fault you, because I do admit that this car does have its own appeal. It's not a wide appeal, I'll say that much, but there is appeal to it, and I understand why some people would consider a vehicle like this. If you want to stand out in the corporate car park, then this is certainly the car for you, because you will struggle to find any car out there that looks quite like this. And given the fact that it is an overall polished and well-prepared package, then that does mean that, again, living with something like this doesn't really come at too great a compromise. It's a pretty good car, this. You've got good deals on it. I think it's pretty well priced. And I do think that GWM is making significant effort towards widening their sales network here in Malaysia, which should then provide a greater degree of confidence in terms of after-sales support. And that so concludes our review of the 2024 Ora Good Cat. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to notify every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.